Hi, it's Meg from So Liberated, and I'm at home in my little patio outdoor studio sewing the Strata top with you today. Like many of you, I am staying at home during the 2020 pandemic, and my son Finn is here dancing behind the camera with me. He's he's my videographer and my film editor, so this is a family affair, and I thought it'd be fun to sew something, especially for those of you who are just starting out sewing or who are wanting to get into it but are feeling a little nervous to get your feet wet. The Strata top here is So Liberated's easiest, most simple pattern, and you know what? I wear my Stratas all the time. They go super well with skirts. I'm wearing mine with a gypsum skirt right now. They go over dresses. I wear them over my hinterland dresses and my metamorphic dresses. I wear them over my pants and anything, but hands down, it's my most worn item in my spring and summer capsule wardrobe. So without further ado, let's talk about what you'll need to get started. You will need your Strata top instructions. You can print them off or just view them on your computer screen. And your pattern pieces, there are only 3, the front, the back, and the neck facing. And I traced mine off onto Swedish tracing paper. You can go ahead and just cut yours out as is, or you can trace it onto, sometimes medical exam paper works. And if you have questions about how to work with digital sewing patterns, I'm going to leave a link below to a tutorial that will walk you through how to do just that. Also, I have underneath here, this gray, are my wool pressing mats, and I use those instead of a large ironing board because I find that it works better in my super small space. These, instead of pins, I am just going to use some fancy pattern weights for cutting out my fabric, and a pressing ham, which helps when pressing small pieces or curves. I have my iron, my fabric shears, and my fabric. So fabric, it's fun to play with fabric with a Strata. You could use any fabric that is sort of a mid to lightweight woven. You could even use somewhat stable knit to sew up this pattern. And you could play around with it a bit. If you have scraps of different colors, you could quilt them together to form your fabric piece. You could play with color blocking. There are a lot of fun things that you could do with that. But I have just some linen, some mid-weight linen here today, and you'll also need some matching thread. And the one thing that I don't have here on my table are my clips. You could use pins or clips. I prefer my little mini magic clips that you'll be seeing as we go along. And I have some painter's tape out here. You could use any tape. If, like me, you have a fabric where the right and the wrong sides are hard to distinguish, you could use some tape to note which side is the front, which side is the back. Okay, I have cut out both the front and the back of the Strata. Both pieces are cut on the fold on the grain line. And now I'm moving on to cut out the neck facing. You do want to cut the neck facing on the bias, and the reason is it's a little more stretchy as it pulls around the neck opening. And you can see here's the marking for the grain line. So that line is going to be on the perpendicular here on the woven fabric. I've cut out the front and the back, and yes, the front is not as wide as the back. It's a fun little design element, and since my fabric is the same on the front and the back, just for some clarity, I'm going to mark the front of my pieces, the right side we often call it, sewing with some masking tape. Before we start sewing anything together, we are going to do some stay stitching along the neck edges. And this is because since it's cut right here on the bias of this fabric, it would have a tendency to stretch out. And we don't want that to happen. We want the neck to maintain its shape as we sew it. So I'm going to sew what's going to be just inside the seam allowance, so it's not going to show on your final garment. We're going to sew it at 1/2 inch, and we're just going to sew a line of stitching from the shoulder down to the center front, shoulder down to the center front, and then the back shoulder down to the center, to the back front, center back, and from the back shoulder down to the center back. I'll show you what that looks like in just a moment. Here's what that stay stitching looks like at 1/2 inch. And now we're going to move on to finishing the edges of the fabric. Now, you have many options when it comes to finishing the raw edges of your fabric, but you definitely don't want to omit this step, because if you do, your garment will not last. The edges will fray and you'll find that you have holes before you expected. So that you want to go ahead and work with what you have. Now, if you have a serger and you're a more advanced sewist, then serging your edges is obviously the way to go. That's the more professional looking overcast edge that you see on many ready-to-wear garments. But if you just have a regular sewing machine, then you have some options. You can use a zigzag stitch and zigzag along the raw edges before you sew things together, which is what I'm going to do today. But you can also opt to do a French seam. I'll put a link in the notes here to a tutorial on how to do a French seam. It sounds very fancy and formal, but it's really not. And it gives a really lovely enclosed finished edge. Okay, so let's finish the edges. I'm going to zigzag the shoulders, the sides of the back, and the shoulders and the sides of the front. Here you can see my zigzag finishing on the side edge here, and on my machine I have an option of doing a 3-part zigzag. This stitch is 0.3 millimeters long and 5.5 millimeters wide, and I find this to be the best option for me if I'm not going to use my serger or do a French seam. And you'll see that I have some other options that I chose for my other edges here. This one is a little less wide, and my machine also does a faux overcast, which you can see here. I'm not a huge fan of the finish as it tends to kind of pull the edge of the fabric in, but you do want to make sure that when you're doing this that you are not getting too close to the edge, but also not going past that 5/8 of an inch in, which is where our official seam will be. So anything that you sew inside of that 5/8 of an inch line is going to be visible as you wear your garment. So you want to keep everything close to the edge, but not at the very edge when you're finishing. I've finished the shoulders and the sides of my front and my back piece. And you see that it has some waviness going on here just from handling it and sewing on it. So I'm going to press that out before I sew these two pieces together. Adding steam just relaxes the fibers and helps them shrink back to their original shape. All right, now I'm going to clip together my front and my back. So I have right sides together. So if you have fabric tape, marking tape like I do, you want to make sure that those two are facing each other. So right sides together, and I'm going to clip along the shoulder seams. And once that is done, you can take this to your sewing machine and with a regular straight stitch, sew at 5/8 of an inch from the fabric edge along the 2 shoulder seams and the 2 side seams. Here's the side seam, and you can see that I have done a little extra stitching along this tight curved edge right here, and that's because that gets the most pulling as you're wearing the Strata. So it's just reinforcing it, making it a little stronger there. And another thing I wanted to mention is that as you're sewing the seam here, go ahead and back tack a little bit, which means go forward a few stitches and then go back a few stitches to really secure that thread before continuing along. And you may find, especially if you're not serging your edges, that you need to clip along the seam allowance here to release some of that extra tension along that little curve in the underarm area. So either before or after you press, go ahead and make some little V-cuts, some little clips into your underarm area. We're going to start with the neck facing, sewing the neck. So get these short ends together, right sides together, and sew a seam along the short ends at 5/8 of an inch from the edge. I've sewn the seam, and now I'm going to open up that seam, press it open, and then I'm going to fold those long edges of the neck facing together. So the wrong sides are together, and that seam you just sewed is enclosed. And then you're going to press that entire neck facing in half. You should now have a tube. Take your neck facing and align it with the center back of the back of your Strata and the back seam of your neck facing, and go ahead and pin all those edges together. All of your raw edges should be stacked together, and you should be pinning the neck facing so that it is on top of the right side or the outside of your Strata top. Now sew a seam 5/8 of an inch from the edge all around the neck opening. Now that you've sewn the neck facing to the neck opening, you're going to trim that seam allowance back to about 1/4 of an inch. Now take that tiny 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, you're going to press it down on top of the neck facing. So pull the neck facing away from the top and lay that seam allowance on top of it and press it all the way around the neck opening. Let's understitch the seam allowance to the neck facing. So sew right along the edge, just on the neck facing, not on the top itself, but on the neck facing, and catch that seam allowance in your stitching. Here you can see that line of stitching. Fold that neck facing in towards the wrong side of your Strata top. That understitching that you just did should not be visible from the exterior of the garment. You're going to sew right on
the edge of the neck facing all the way around the neck opening, and that line of stitching will be visible from the exterior of the garment. Here is the finished neck opening. You should see 2 lines of stitching on the interior of the garment and just 1 line of stitching on the exterior of the garment. Use a pressing ham to give that neckline a good steam. Let's hem the sleeves. It's pretty easy to do. Just take the raw edge of the fabric and fold it 1/4 of an inch toward the wrong side of your top. And press all the way around. Go back around that opening in the arm one more time, pressing up once again 1/4 of an inch so that that raw edge is enclosed. I've sewn the hems of my sleeves on both sides. I've done a line of stitching as close to that inner folded edge as possible. And we're going to repeat that same process to finish the hem of your top. So fold that raw edge up towards the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch, press all the way around, and then come back again, sew up another 1/4 of an inch, and sew right along that folded edge.
All right, your strata top is done. Mine's done here. If you have any questions about this process, if you want to modify yours in any way, go ahead and shoot us an email, support@sewliberated.com. We'll be happy to help you, and thanks for sewing along with me today.